Okay, we're going to create an effect now of a meteor entering the atmosphere of a planet, and I'm going to demonstrate and show you how to create that sort of disk effect you get around the object and sort of that burning circular effect. And we're going to do that all with dynamics, and before we load in the meteor or anything, we're going to set up the dynamics in layout. So we're going to go to the items tab and we're going to select dynamic object, and then we're going to grab particle. And we want to set this to HV emitter because we're going to be emitting the particles or applying hypervoxels to them. And you could also use as a particle emitter, and then if you wanted to just render with a glow effect on those particles, and you can get a pretty nice effect that way too. But we're going to use HV emitter because it looks a little bit better. And we can keep the emitter name emitter because there's only going to end up being 2 in the scene total. And we can change our birth rate now to 150 frames per second, or sorry, 150 particles per second. And our particle limit, we're going to shoot all the way up to 10,000 just so we have enough. Actually, that's 100,000, but alright. And now we're going to change our full amount of frames in our animation up to 180 and generate by collision event. And as you can see, all of our particles disappeared, and that's because we don't have our collision event set yet. I want to change our nozzle to a box, and I'm going to change our generator size to 2 meters all the way around. Now this method I consider sort of a boolean, and the reason I'll show you the reason why that is in a sec. But first I'm going to add a null object, and we're going to use this null object as our main animation point. So we don't have to edit and animate every single object in the scene. We can just animate this null, and then if we need to, anything independently of that. So I'm going to grab our particle object really quick, hit M for the parent item, and select null. And I'm going to grab that null object again, and go ahead and hit this little crosshair up in the perspective view. And this way we're centered on the object as throughout that whole animation, or wherever we move it. And I'm going to move it down towards the positive x-axis. And now we just have a little bit of an animation right there. But no particles as of yet. So what we want to do is, now we're going to add a collision object and click OK. And now this needs to be set to, we're going to keep it at sphere, but our mode needs to be set to event, because unless it's set to event, our particles won't know that this is our event emitter. I'm going to go ahead and hit M on the keyboard for our motion options and parent it to that null. And now it's with the rest of the scene. I'm also going to move it backward, and I want to make it so it's just penetrating the inside of that box. And then what we're going to have, our effect, is that only the particles are being emitted from the section where the event collision is touching it. And this is a really cool way to make complex particle effects. You could take a large box and add little bits and pieces all over where you want the particles to be created. And if you're not familiar with dynamics, or if you've been doing it for a little while actually, and you're probably wondering right now why I don't just create an object, because if I created sort of a half disk object, you could also create the particles from that, and you would get the same effect we're getting right now without having to go through all of this mess. But the only problem with that is, if your scene is kind of complex and you have that object there and you're really paying attention to your particles and animating them, if you use an object as an emitter, you're going to have to set its dissolve value to 100%. And when you set the dissolve value to 100%, if you have a different object selected other than the one with 100% dissolve, it doesn't show up in the scene. And then you can't really evaluate how certain things are reacting with each other, and it's just a lot easier if you do it this way, because then they'll constantly be showing up in the scene, and you don't have to worry about dissolving any objects out and then not being able to see them when you're making edits. Okay, so now we have our front of our object emitting in a disk shape, but the only problem is it's not actually creating a disk effect. So we also need to add, undo that, I was moving it. we need to create another collision. So if we select from Add Dynamic Object, we're going to select Collision again. And we just set it to Collision again, as far as the name. And Bounce is where it needs to be. We're going to close out that panel, hit M on the keyboard, and our parent item is null. And we'll just move that back, making sure we're on frame 0. And now we want to make sure it's not equal with our event and that it's just a little bit behind it. And if we scroll through the animation now, you'll see that we're getting that nice disc shape. And we can also use this for like fireball effects and things like that if you're going from a more precise animation and you don't just want it coming off the whole object. So this is a good way to kind of define which area. And this is also like a Boolean bounce object like this with the default settings, of course. And I'm going to go ahead and calculate these. So Shift and O and hit P in the keyboard to bring up our object properties and hit calculate. And that's just going to accurately calculate our particles, which it didn't really make any big changes, but depending on how many collisions objects you have, and if you're using hard effects, soft effects, things like that, you definitely want to calculate. In our last tutorial, Pyrotechnics 1, we didn't calculate because of the effect that we would get from the rotating objects. But I'm going to show you in a little bit how to actually correct that so you can calculate and still get that same effect. Now if you take a look at our particles, they're advancing a little too far back, so we can go ahead and change their lifetime. Open up our object properties again, hit P on the keyboard, select our emitter, and we're going to go to the effects emitter, double click on it, select particle, and our lifetime will change to 45. And as you can see now, it only just extends the end of that sphere. And of course you could reduce it even more if you wanted, and that way you could get a real sharp disk. And it just really depends on how big of an object you want. You could also edit your bounce if we wanted to, and your other or both collision objects, so you kind of could squish them together so it's not a perfect sphere and it's more of an oblong shape. But we're going to leave it the way it is right now because it's going to be fine for what we're doing. So now the next thing we're going to do is add in our little Meteor object that we're going to be using. And I want to take a look at our grid size right now. And these are 2 meters. So that we need to create our meteor, so it's just under 2 meters. So we're going to go to Modeler. And we have that emitter object in there. So we're going to go to New Object. And I'm going to change the grid size to 1 meter. If you can see down here, so that it's 1 meter, just zooming to get to that point. And I'm going to create a ball within those 2 meters. And maybe make it a little smaller. Hit N on the keyboard, go to tessellation. Segments of 4 is fine. Spacebar to end that tool. And I'm just going to add a jitter really quick, so Shift J, normal. And we're going to set our range to 0.025 and actually 0.05, and just editing that a little more. Now we're going to use the magnet tool, which is Shift and colon, and we're just going to define an area. And this is the same, undo. This is the same way we made our cutting objects in the first tutorial. So it's the same principle, but you can also use it to create a meteorite, which is what we're doing right now. So I'm not really going to go into it too far in depth. Just want to kind of pull out these basic shapes so it's a little more interesting. And we're just going to give it a surface name of rock. And we'll save it as rock and then send the object into layout. Okay, now we also want to parent this item to our null. So we'll hit M on the keyboard, parent to null, and go back to frame 0. And we're still in the perspective view here. And it's really good if you have this crosshair checked, and that way it just centers everything the whole time, especially when you're using parented items, and that way it'll just move with it the whole time. Okay, and now we have that disk effect, and the meteorite right behind it. Now, if you really wanted to, you could actually make this meteorite the collision object, depending on what kind of shape you're looking for. In this case, we wanted sort of a perfect looking disk or a spherical convex shape, but I can go ahead and change this really quick just to show you what it would look like if we had our meteorite as our collision object. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and set up our animation for the meteorite, which is just a rotation. So we'll go to the end of the timeline, and since this is the child, we can rotate this and it won't affect anything else in the scene. And we're just going to make a few rotations on all axes, nothing spectacular. And that should be fine. That's actually rotating kind of quickly. If we go down to our numeric stats right here, we're just going to change everything to 150. And that way, we don't go too far. But you see we get a little bit of a weird shape there. It's not quite rotating. And that's mostly because of our bank. So if we turn our bank off and take a look at what happens, it will fully rotate now. And it's only doing about 1 revolution. Or not even. Of course, it's only rotating 150, and 360 would be a full revolution, but so it's about halfway. But that still looks pretty good. But we want to turn off this other collision now, so we're going to select collision 2, go to our object properties, and I'm going to turn off effects collision, and just uncheck it, and it will no longer apply to the scene. And we're going to grab our object now, our rock object, and hit Shift O, and then hit P for the object properties. And now we can select from Dynamics tab, Add Dynamic Collision. Double click on Effects Collision. Our type is going to be Object. And now if you had a subdivision object, so in other words, if you hit Tab in Lightwave and you haven't frozen the object or anything like that, you can select Object Subdivision and it'll automatically detect the fact that it's subdivided. Radius level at 0 because we want it to go right up to the edges, and because we can change the radius level to 1, then it's going to deflect 1 meter outside of the object's particle or polygons, and we can keep our powers all the same right now. And we're going to take a look at what happens. Go to Object Properties again, and we're going to hit Calculate. And that's just going to calculate all those particles in the collision. And since we're using Hypervoxels too, the fact that they're going in to the object just a little is not really a big concern. But as you can see, we're getting a really neat effect out of that. Because with that collision, it's not a perfect sphere. And if that's the effect you're looking for, then this is definitely the way to do it. Otherwise, you could bring back your other collision object. But this way, it flows along the grooves and the cracks and things like that of the actual surface itself, and it just looks a little more realistic that way. It just kind of blends together more nicely. So I'm actually going to keep it like this, just for this demonstration. If we wanted that perfect disk effect, all we got to do is just turn that other collision object back on, just hitting that check mark. But I'm going to leave it like this, because it looks really cool this way. Okay, now we also want to make this meteorite an emitter, because we want to be emitting extra particles from it. And the way to do that is just open up the object properties, and we can add emitter. And if we take a look, we're going to have the same problem that we had in the last tutorial. So if I calculate this, you can see that because of the rotation of that object, these particles are shooting off every which way, and we want them to consistently follow behind it. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is undo that emitter, and we're going to remove it. And we want to set a separate emitter in the inside of it. And that's going to be our best way, because with that rotation, it's really going to throw it off. And we have enough definition with our particles in front of this collision to do that and not have to really worry about it. And then we're going to be applying Hypervoxels to add smoke and a little bit of fire to that back trail that it's going to be leaving. So go back to our dynamic object and add particle, and use an HV emitter, and click OK. And before I do anything else, hit M. Make sure we select the layout, hit M on the keyboard, and select null so that it's parented. And I'm going to go ahead and move that to the center of the object. And then we could change the nozzle to object surface if we wanted, but it's not going to affect anything because it's not applied to a surface. So we'll change it to sphere. And now it's going to be generating those particles, as you can see from the back right here, from the sphere. But we're also going to be getting another effect because of the fact that this object is a collision object. And that's one of the reasons why we had such a problem earlier too, is because if this is producing particles and colliding with particles, it's of course going to create some really weird effects. And we're also getting weird effects right here too because of the event, although we really shouldn't be. So if I calculate that, those will probably disappear. But we want to size this up a bit. We want to make it about the size of our meteorite. And I'm going to go ahead and calculate this. So I'm going to close this out, go back to our object properties, and get this out of the way and calculate and see what happens. And we're still getting a lot of that weird motion in there because it is colliding with the actual object itself. And it's not from that other collision, it's from the meteorite. But there's a way to fix that. So I'm just going to end this calculation. If you ever want to end a calculation, you just hit the control key, and that'll end it out. Alright, so we'll open up our effects emitter properties for this new emitter that we have, and we're going to select the group and select new group 2, which I've already created. And if you want to create a new group, you just go to new group and then type in the group name. And now what a group is a way to separate your collision objects from other objects in the scene. And now if we took this first emitter right here and our collision for that, the event collision, and then also that meteorite, that would be group 1. And we just have it set to default right now because we're not going to have any more groups. But we could go ahead and create a new group and set them all in the same group, and that way those only affect each other. So the objects in each group only affect the objects in its own group. And that's how we got rid of our interaction with the collision. And you could also set up a group, even though if you have this object set as collision and as emitter, we could go ahead too and also change that group on that one and then not have to worry about it. Okay, but I'm going to make a slight change here now because we're going to be adding hypervoxels to this secondary emitter object. We'll be adding them to both, but this one specifically I want to look at because our hypervoxels are bigger, and they'll probably be about this big, and we wouldn't have the flames going out that high, so we want to make it just a little bit smaller. We'll change our generator size to 1.1, and now calculate that, and as you can see, we're still getting them kind of coming off kind of high, so maybe we'll even make it a little bit smaller. But it's mostly because it's still reacting slightly with that event collision. And as you can see, our particles are kind of shooting forward and then curving around that event collision. So I'm going to go ahead and set up another group for that secondary object, and maybe that will get rid of it. Dynamics can be a little tricky sometimes, and it's not always consistent. Even in the tutorial, or before I started doing the tutorial and did a few test scenes of this, it would be different every single time I did it. So there's always a few things you have to keep in mind. But I'm going to select new group. I'm going to call this main group. And then hit OK. And now I'm going to select all the objects in that group. And that is collision 1. And our major effects emitter, or our main one. That's going to go into main group. And our secondary collision it's not on, so we can't really click on it, and it's not affecting the scene. And right now with uncalculated particles, everything seems to look okay. But I'm going to go ahead and calculate that now. And now, if we take a look, we can see that everything is corrected. So just by adding that to a new group, it fixed the problem. And sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. I didn't have that problem before, but I'm having it now. So now we got our size change right here. And it's actually a bit smaller than we wanted to have it, but we can make a few changes to that, and that's okay. Open up our object properties, and actually we're going to make sure we set our particle lifetime. So double click on it, go to the particle tab, and we're going to set our lifetime to 180 frames, and that way it lasts throughout the entire animation. And as you can see, we're already kind of getting that nice effect. We have the frontal area of where it's penetrating the atmosphere too. And if you wanted to actually have the atmosphere in the animation, we're not really going to add that. We're not going to create the full scene. But if you have an animation layer set up, you could even create a gigantic emitter box and have that be the animation. If you're going to have like a kind of like a Hypervoxels box, or a box filled with clouds, something like that, you could create an emitter object around that and set it to event. And then as the event object is penetrating it, it will create the particles in that spherical fashion through the object. And you could also set up your lifetime that way too, so that only the flames are being created as it's passing through that object. So if we had this passing through the object right now, once the event collision has left this object, of course it's fixed right now, but if we had it traveling through, it would only create the particles as it moved through, and then once it reached the other side, the particles wouldn't be created anymore. And that's kind of an automatic way, so you don't have to set up a fixed frame number. So if right now we had this wanting to start at 40, in this case we'd just set the fixed frame number, so Shift O, hit P, double click on the emitter and set it to fixed at 40, and what that'll do is start creating that at 40 as if the atmosphere is starting at frame 40. But if you wanted an automatic way to do it, then of course you could just create a really large box and have this traveling through it. And of course that box would be fixed into place and not moving along with the object. Okay, so now we want to make our changes to our second emitter. So we're going to grab our second emitter object, open up the properties for it again. And for our generator size, we're of course going to have to make it just a little bit bigger. We're going to go 1.2. And we don't want it to explode at all. We're going to make most of our changes in Hypervoxels as far as the tail. Because if we zoom out right here, as you can see, the particles aren't shrinking at all and not moving downward. But we can make some of those changes in Hypervoxels with an envelope, a size envelope. But if you really must do this with the dynamics, because you're applying a different effect to it and you want these to sort of compress, then you need to add a wind emitter, or not emitter, but a wind dynamic object. So we go to items and we select dynamic object and we select wind, and wind is fine, we don't have to name anything else. And we could do explosion, but give it a power of -100, and that's going to direct everything inward. I'm going to go ahead and hit M on the keyboard, parent the item to the null so it's moving along with the rest of the scene. Make sure we're at frame 0 so we're not creating any keyframes. And we can set this behind the object. And I'll also open that wind properties again because we need to assign this to that group. So we have it set to new group 2. And now, as you can see, we've already made some changes here. And we have our particles passing through that wind, and using the explosion is great because normally it would shoot the particles outward, but since we have it set to a negative value, what it'll do is it'll compress it into sort of a thin tail, and depending on how large you have that wind emitter detects on how much the fall off is going to be and when that's going to be created, and of course the power. So if I pull back this and set our power to -50 and close that out, now we can see the effect, of course, isn't as much. So you could change the power as you want. You could also, if you wanted this to be a much quicker effect, but you wanted more of a nice transition, you could add another winded object behind it, scale it down, and change the power slightly, and then have even more of a tail. So we're going to change that back now to -100. And actually, if you want to see what it looks like for just using the explosion effect, depending on what kind of effect you're looking for, I could set that to 100, and you'll see that now it's doing the exact opposite, and it's expanding our particles as our meteorite is moving. And maybe that's the effect you're looking for. Maybe you're looking for something that's going to have not a tail on it, per se, where it has a tip, but the particles all shooting outward. And we can bring our object properties back and even set that to 300. And now we get a real big effect on it. And if you want, you can move that wind object in closer, so they're expanding a little closer to the object. And I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. And that way they're expanding directly with it. And we have our condensed particles in front with our collision that fade off, and then this trail particles. So there's just lots of things you can play around with and little things you can do. And there's all different types of wind. If you go through here, you can set it by direction. So it's going off in a specific direction. Rotation on the Y. And that way it's kind of rotating this way. You could set it to cylinder explosion. And of course it's not directly on that emitter, so it's going to look a little different. You could just even have turbulence if you wanted, so it scatters the particles around. Donut is kind of a neat little effect, and in this particular case it keeps it real straight in the center and then little bits and pieces off on the outside, and that's just in the shape of a torus if you look at it. Drag doesn't seem to do anything at this point. You can just do random, where it'll just randomly throw your particles around. A vortex is kind of neat, and that gives you a very uneven look to the particles, and it really depends on just what you're using it for. There's also sticky wind, which will kind of force all the particles together. Hemisphere, and kind of get that same effect as we had before. And then path, which won't really do anything in this case, but we're going to change it back to explosion. Set our power to -100 to where we were before, and actually -75. And we can, because now we have that wind object, we can go into our effects emitter for that tail and change our size again. Just because now we're working with something to condense, not 15, 1.5, to condense our particles immediately, since we have it so close to the emitter, so we don't really have to worry about the size of the HV objects now. So you have to make little adjustments here and there. Okay, what I also want to do is set up our camera motion now. And as you can see, we're getting kind of a weird stretch effect right here. And I'm going to change that in a sec. I'll show you how to fix that. But I'm going to select our camera and hit M on the keyboard for our motion options, and we're going to target the rock, and now the camera is going to follow that throughout the animation. And I'll pull it back just a little, move that camera, make sure we're doing it on the x-axis, and this is just so we can see the full view. So we'll pull it back even farther and kind of see the tail when we start editing our hypervoxels. And maybe we'll move it even more. And that should be good. It'll give us a good evaluation. As you can see, because of the wind, we're kind of getting a weird stretching effect. But that might be because of our calculation, so I'm going to calculate it, because we haven't done that since we've made our changes. And every time you make changes to a particle system, you have to recalculate the whole scene, and not just individual particles, because it will throw everything else off. So now if we take a look at it, everything seems to be okay. So now we're going to go into our Hypervoxels settings and start editing each one of the sets of the particles. Alright, so if we hit Control F6, it's going to bring up our effects volumetrics. And we're going to click Add Volumetric Hypervoxels. And double click on Hypervoxels. Okay, now we need to activate our emitter objects as hypervoxels. And we're going to do that second one first, so we just double click on it. I'm going to hit F7 on the keyboard to bring up our Hypervoxels Viper preview. Set it to 320 by 240 so it renders a little quicker. And we want to change our surface now. Object type to volume. I'm going to set that to normal mode right now. And as you can see, because of the effect that we're getting with our wind, we don't really need to make too many edits to our particle size. And I'm going to go to Hypertexture right away and change our effect to dissolve and expand. And our effect speed, I'll just slow it down so that it's just dissolving and expanding towards the end. Of course, it really affects that front part. So if you wanted, you could, since we already kind of have our shape that we have set up, you could just set that to regular dissolve, and that won't edit it as much. And you can edit the width, the size of the tail if you wanted at this point, just by changing the effect speed. And we'll leave it about right there. It would normally be a lot longer, but just for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to make it a little bit smaller. Just to kind of show you real quick how everything works. Alright, we're going to add now there's different ways we could do this. We haven't really covered sprites at all. If we change our object volume to sprite, we could actually render a lot quicker in the scene. And you can actually still get some pretty neat effects from sprites. And what sprites are two-dimensional polygons in the scene that are rendered with a little bit of a voxel on them. And you can change, right now we have one slice, so that means it's just rendering a small section of that hypervoxel and with one plane. And we could set it to 3, and that's going to render 3 slices of that full hypervoxel. I'm going to set it back to 1 because that's all we need right now. But I also want to show you something in layout. In the main view, if we open up our display options by hitting D on the keyboard, actually, nope, it's in Hypervoxels. Okay, if we click Show Particles in Hypervoxels, you'll see that the particles show up in layout. And that's really neat. What you could also do if you're doing animatics and you don't really want to go into the full depth of creating the hypervoxels, and you want to be able to see all the different smoke effects without actually having to render anything, this is a great method for animatics and things like that. And you can even get some final renders from sprites that will look okay. And it all shows up in layout, and even the color will show up. So if we change our, we'll bring a Viper back up by hitting F7. We're going to change our color now, and we're going to hit T so we get a texture map. We're going to change our layer type to gradient and our input parameter to particle age. And that's going to affect the age throughout a predetermined amount of frames. We're going to set it to 180 frames, and what that's going to do is now we have our influence from frame 1 to frame 180 from each life of the particle and how it changes throughout the animation. We'll set a parameter just by clicking, and we can drag it down, or you can set it by typing in the numeric value. And I'm going to click another parameter up around 24 or so. And this first one, we're going to make like a bright orangish yellow. And you can see the effect it takes right there. And if you change this other parameter, you can see the size changes. But we're going to make it kind of close because we want to make this next one kind of a darker orange. And that's affecting a little bit too much, so we're going to pull this bottom one up now. And we want to kind of have this turn into smoke. So we'll set this to a dark gray, or kind of a mid-tone gray. And we'll add another parameter, and we'll change that to even a darker gray. And as you can see, we have that nice fade. And we don't really have a texture really set on this sprite right now, so you can't really see too much that's going on. but I'm going to brighten up these colors just a little and click Use Texture. And actually, if we go back to this texture editor for the color and we copy selected layer, use texture, go to our luminosity texture editor, paste replace all layers, then that's going to automatically show up in our luminosity, and then we can adjust our luminosity values where we had our colors before. And because of the lightness of the colors, it automatically makes a change, but we're going to set this value to 150 and see how bright that gets. It's not quite bright enough, so maybe 200. And we'll go down and we'll set that to 150, and maybe we'll set that one to 200 as well. And this next one we'll set to 200. Oh, I'll close that out. Grab that next one, set that to 200. And maybe we'll take this value of this other one and bring it down just a little. And the value of this can stay where it's at 12. Because it really doesn't need to have any luminosity at all, actually. We could even just set that to 0. So after that point, it's all smoke. Of course, you can't really see this trail right now because our background color is black. So I'm going to change that real quick and hit Control F5 to bring up our effects backdrop options. I'm going to select Gradient Backdrop. And now, if we render it, you can see we have our gradient, but it's real dark brown down here, and we don't want that. So we're going to change this, our ground color, to match up with the sky color, and that way we get a nice blend in between the two colors. So we can just use the RGB values to match it up. So red is 120, and green is 180, and blue is 240. Hit enter. Now if we render that, you can see we have that nice transition in there. And if you don't have the same color, there will be a seam. And we could just change this other one to kind of a darker blue. And go ahead and render that. And now you can see the smoke that we're getting, and the fact that there's no luminosity right here. There's a little luminosity right here, and that's just kind of a lighting effect that you can do to show that the smoke is being lit up because it's so close to that fire without having to do any other effects. And we're going to click Use Texture. We're going to add a hypertexture now. There's already crumple added. We're going to change it to turbulence, and we want to change our small power to 0.75, and our frequencies to 5, and our contrast to 50. And that's just going to mix things up just a little bit. Change our scale to 0.5, and that'll scale it down just a little. Okay, what we could also do if we wanted is just make the size a little bit bigger. And this is just kind of a neat way that you can use sprites. And if I show you what it looks like in layout, you can see that change of the color in layout, and it looks great because this is, like I said, this is awesome for animatics. You'll be able to see everything that's going on without having to render. And then when you want to, you can change that to Hypervoxels, or even keep it as a sprite in the final render if you tweak it enough and make it look right. We'll open our Hypervoxels back up. We're going to make some changes. F7 for the Viper. And we're going to set this back to volume. And by setting it back to volume, we have big changes that we're going to have to do. We'll set our contrast down to 0. And that makes a little bit of effect. The scale, 1 meters. And our frequencies we can change to 1. And our small power, 0.5. And just make a few changes in there. We can change our density if we wanted to kind of lower that effect overall. And you could also use some of the presets too if you wanted to kind of get a different effect. I'm going to turn off textured shadows and volumetric shadows, and that's also going to improve a large amount of the quality. And by default, volumetric shadows and textured shadows will be on. And that's great if you want, you know, shadows on your object, but in this case we have, of course, fire, and therefore that wouldn't really have any major shadows on it. Textured shadows, when you have that checked, it will increase your rendering speed quite a bit, and so will volumetric shadows. If we turn those off, now we have that effect right there. and we're just going to leave that the way it is. We could of course tweak a few things, but overall it looks pretty much like we needed to. Like I said, there's a few things we could change, but we'll leave them alone. And we want to start working on our other emitter. So we're going to go to emitter 1, and as you can see we have that sort of disc shape. We'll change that to volume, and go to shading options, advanced, turn off volumetric shadows and textured shadows. And actually for this we can go ahead and use a preset if we wanted to. Hit F8 on the keyboard to bring up our presets panel. And there's also a lot of presets available online for this kind of stuff, and we might even put together a little collection of Hypervoxel presets that should be available soon, hopefully. And we can select fire-ish, and that's usually a pretty good texture, or a good Hypervoxel. It always needs to be a little edited. These presets are, the way they look never really shows up in the scene, and that's just because those are specific to the scene they were created in. But this gives us our basic gradients and things like that that we'll need. We just need to change our density. We're going to go to geometry and change our size. And maybe not so large. We could add our hypertexture if we wanted. We could change it to dissolve and expand, or just dissolve if you wanted to. You could do billowing on the front, and that's the way all of these are billowing as they're going along, and that's a really neat effect. You could even use sprites on this if you wanted to. Change your shading to match up, of course. But I'm going to change it back to volume. And if you wanted to too, there's other real neat presets. Fireball 2, of course, needs a lot of editing because of the size, or just regular fireball. But like, if you take a look at the size, those are definitely going to need to be changed, and that's mostly in these hypertexture options. You just size it up a bit. But I have a preset that we're using right here, and that needs to be changed. The envelope, turn that off, and that's pretty much the same thing we had before, just made a few alterations to it. And if we turn on volumetric shadows, you can see it makes a huge difference. You get real dark in the front, and maybe that's what you're looking for, because it all depends on really the kind of effect that you're going for, and specifically what object you're using. And we could change our lighting options, and that makes a big difference depending on where the lights are in the scene. You could add a light to the front of this meteorite. So if you had a light in the front of it and you created a lens flare with it, or a volumetric light, so you got a nice big glow around it, you would have to set that to Raylight. And Raylight is covered in another chapter in this tutorial, and I'll show you how to use that. So go ahead and close this out. And as you can see in here too, if we show the particles as hypervoxels, those still show up in the scene. So if I did that for our other ones too, I could go back to our hypervoxels, Control F6, double click on hypervoxels, and I can go to basic, or geometry, sorry, and show particles. Then we can see them in layout. Of course, it's not as nice looking as the sprites look in layout, and like I said, if you really want to switch between the two as far as doing animatics or just testing out your scene to see how it looks, that's what you can do. And there's also some neater things you can do by the fact that we have this null object. If I select the null, since everything's selected or connected to that object, I could go ahead and create some keyframes if I wanted to, and just kind of move all these objects up. And we've got a lot of stuff in the scene right now, so that's kind of taken a little toll on the system here. But we could also move this, if we go to our perspective view, and move this to the side, and just do a little bit of an animation here. Just something a little more interesting. As you can see though, because of our displacement on the meteor texture of where the pivot point is, since it's pivoting at a different point than where we have our motion for our object, it's going to look a little bit different, and it might not add up or look perfect. And it could just be the outline of the null object too. But we'll give this a little more make this a little more interesting, just so I can show you that you don't just have to go in straight lines with this animation, and that it can be changed quite a bit and you still get a good effect. So go ahead and move that around. And like I said, this looks terrible right now where it's at, because it's the way it's calculating. But once we calculate the dynamics, you'll be able to see that everything actually looks okay. So we'll go back to our camera view, which is following the object throughout. And now we're going to hit Shift O, hit P on the keyboard. So make sure we select a dynamic object and hit calculate. And now it's going to calculate all those particles for the animation. And now if we take a look and we can play it, you can see we got a real neat looking effect here that you can see in layout. And by having these extra particles on here, it looks even better. If I was to change these to sprites, just to show you what it would look like if you were creating an animatic, Control F6, double click on Hypervoxels, and I'm going to change these both just to sprites for the time being. And you can really see what it looks like now. You could also see these planes that are created, which are the slices. And the slices that we were talking about before, where you have 1, 2, or 3, you can see that right now we have one slice for each one of the particles, and if you up that, it'll create another cross section and keep creating cross sections to make those sprites. But we're pretty much done with this animation. Like I said, you can go in and tweak the hypervoxels if you want. I'm going to show this from a different angle. You can kind of see that because we have that real quick motion in there, it's kind of leaving behind the particles. So if we wanted to, of course that's not the kind of if it was going that way, we'd have a little bit of rotation. We didn't create any rotation. Okay, I just wanted to show you really quick that effect I was talking about, where you had that penetrating the atmosphere. And what we have is just our emitter object. This is just an emitter set to box, and we've just taken our rock that we had before, our sort of meteor, and just set that to their collision event. And if you go through that, you can see that it's only creating the particles as it passes through, and that way you can kind of set that up if you want to. You could even add a wind and have this connected to a null if you wanted, a wind object behind it, and just set it up the way you had it before, and that way you can get the motion. And for the wind, you'd have to change it because the actual emitter object isn't moving, so you'll have to set up your wind object to kind of explode the particles that way, or you could use the move to have it move on a specific axis, and that way it'll move the particles around and they don't just stay still. But I wanted to show you that so you can kind of give an idea of all the different things you can do with dynamics.